That summer rain that night had washed away all traces when Thomas Reed vanished from the small house by the Combahee River, amid the incessant chirping of insects and the thick mist of the Beaufort swamp. His car remained parked in the driveway, wallet and keys still on the kitchen table, while his wife, trembling, called the police, saying her husband had just gone out for some fresh air. When dawn broke, police waded through the mud, finding strange skid marks on the ground and a faint metallic tang in the air, and the disappearance quickly became an obsession that lasted more than 4 decades. Throughout that time, the people of Beaufort still believed in the image of the gentle widow, the woman who had spent half her life praying for her husband's return. But then, an unexpected storm in 2024 stirred the river that seemed to have slept peacefully, revealing a secret buried deep in the mud, something that would make the entire town reevaluate everything they once believed to be true. What do you think really happened that summer night? Leave your guesses in the comments below. We really want to know what you see amid the layers of mud in this truth. On the morning of June 12, 2024, after a massive storm swept through Beaufort County, the rain had just stopped, and the air was thick with the smell of mud and pine resin. In the St. Helena swamp, where tall reeds towered over head height and strands of Spanish moss draped down to the water's surface, a county work crew was dredging a drainage canal to clear the flow, clogged with debris and fallen trees. A man named Calvin Brooks, operating an old yellow excavator, suddenly felt the bucket hit something hard like metal. He shut off the engine, jumped down, and as he brushed away the wet mud, he saw what looked like a piece of decayed green plastic cloth wrapped around a long mottled earth-colored mass. When a sliver of sunlight pierced through the gray clouds and shone down, he stepped back. It was human bones, tangled among the reed roots. A piercing scream rang out, shattering the post-storm morning stillness. Beaufort police arrived quickly, cordoning off the area. The small river connecting to the Combahee was deathly still, its murky surface reflecting the flashing red and blue lights. A forensics officer bent down, using gloved hands to lift from the mud an old silver ring, inside which was engraved the faint inscription, TR 1977. Local reporters from WSCB station crowded behind the yellow tape. In the sheriff's notebook, the first line was written, "Adult male human bones, located about 15 yards from the water's edge, wrapped in green plastic sheeting, with personal metal item." By noon, a light rain began falling again. A young officer stood watching the fiddler crabs scuttle around the deeply dug pit, murmuring quietly, "No one deserves to lie here all those years." The news spread quickly through Beaufort, then to Georgetown, then Charleston, a skeleton found in the riverbank swamp, possibly linked to an old missing persons case. Elderly folks in the small coffee shop on Bay Street started gossiping, each mentioning a different name, as if memories of the vanished were rising up with the fresh mud scent. As afternoon fell, the discovery site was covered with white tarps, and police transported the evidence to the Columbia lab. The day's final rain pattered on their vehicle roofs, the siren echoing far away like a rebound from the past. A young reporter, soaked in her raincoat, stood before the camera, speaking clearly in the evening broadcast. Today in Beaufort County, authorities discovered human skeletal remains believed to have lain under the swamp bed for over 4 decades. Police have not released the victim's identity, but a ring engraved with the year 1977 may be a key clue to reopening one of the area's longest-standing missing persons cases. Somewhere in the light rain, the Baptist church bell on Main Street tolled long. The murky water from the canal flowed into the river, carrying bits of moss, dry leaves, and freshly stirred silt. Beaufort, the town that had been quiet for so many years, was suddenly shaken by an unanswered question: who was that man, and what had left him lying in this place? Before the St. Helena swamp revealed its secret, Thomas Reed had been a familiar part of Beaufort, the man whose face everyone knew but few truly understood. In the summer of 1980, Thomas was 33, a maintenance engineer at the Gaylord paper mill in Georgetown, driving his battered old silver Ford through roads draped with hanging Spanish moss. He lived with his wife, Elaine, in a small wooden house by the Combahee River, where mornings blended the scent of pine resin with coffee, and evenings the crickets chirping drowned out conversation. They were the model Southern couple, he quiet and reserved, she gentle and sociable. Every Sunday they attended the Baptist church in downtown Beaufort, sitting in the second row from the front, always bowing their heads in prayer before the pastor began the sermon. Neighbors said Thomas was diligent, rising at 4 a.m. to head to the mill. He liked tinkering with small things, the water pump, an old radio, the fishing boat. To outsiders, the Reed family was the picture of tranquility. But in that wooden house by the river, small cracks had begun to appear. Close friends had seen Thomas sitting alone at the bar on Bay Street, quietly sipping beer and staring out at the docks, as if preoccupied. He often complained of fatigue, saying the mill was getting new supervisors and things weren't the same anymore. Elaine was increasingly involved in church activities, handling the family finances, often away in the afternoons. They talked less, and each time they did, their voices grew a little heavier. On the afternoon of July 18th, with temperatures hitting 95 degrees, the air thick with humidity and river algae smell, Thomas left the mill later than usual, his work shirt dusted with paper pulp, sweat soaking his collar. Neighbors saw him stop at the gas station on the way home, buying a bottle of water and a pack of Camel filters, the kind he rarely smoked. As night fell, Elaine said her husband hadn't returned, but dinner was still on the table, cooled, with a plate set aside for him. Around 11, the neighbor across the street heard a distant bang from the direction of the docks, then silence. A hot wind carried the scent of rain from the swamp, and the insects suddenly went quiet, as if someone had stopped the rhythm. When the clock struck midnight, and Thomas still hadn't come home, Elaine called his coworkers at the mill, asking if he'd stayed for an extra shift. No one had seen him since leaving the gate. She called the pastor next, her voice trembling but steady. He might have gone night fishing again, he'll probably be back by morning. The pastor advised waiting until dawn, but an hour later, she dialed 911 to report him missing. When Sheriff Harold Mixon arrived with 2 young officers, they found the front door unlocked, Thomas's Ford parked right by the porch, his keys, wallet, and watch left on the kitchen table. Elaine sat on a wooden chair, eyes red-rimmed but speaking clearly. I'm afraid something bad has happened. He never leaves without a word. Outside the porch, the rain started sprinkling again, splattering murky droplets against the windows. Police noted every detail, the tidy kitchen, fresh mud footprints on the floor, a coffee mug still warm. One officer went to the backyard, shining a flashlight toward the path leading to the docks, faint tire tracks from an old truck fading in the rainwater. When he returned, Mixon nodded slightly, signaling to secure the area. Elaine clutched a scarf, whispering, I just hope he's still out there somewhere. In the yellow lamplight spilling through the window, the shadow of the thin woman stretched long on the wall, trembling like the flickering candle by the dining table. The next morning, Beaufort's sky remained overcast, humidity rising from the Combahee River like a thick fog blanket. Sheriff Harold Mixon returned to the Reed's wooden house with 2 young officers, beginning the official investigation. They combed every corner, from kitchen to bedroom, noting every detail, back door undamaged, no signs of forced entry, but the rug by the kitchen door soaked and muddied. On the table, Thomas's brown leather wallet was intact with ID, driver's license, a photo of the couple by their old fishing boat. Elaine stood in the kitchen, arms crossed over her shoulders, eyes fixed on the fogged window. She answered each police question steadily, her voice hoarse. I went to bed at 10:30. When I woke up, he was gone. I thought he stepped out for air. The officer jotted notes, his gaze flicking quickly to her hands, nails streaked with a strange gray, possibly paper pulp, possibly river mud. Mixon went to the riverbank behind the house, where a path led to a small wooden dock. In the weak sunlight, he spotted long drag marks in the mud, as if someone had pulled a heavy object to the water. Clear imprint of a man's boot heel, beside it a smaller bare footprint. Mixon bent down, shone his flashlight, picked up a scrap of green felt fabric stuck with sand. Bag it for evidence, he said, voice low. Nearby, the young officer found a damp camel filter butt mixed in the reeds. Thomas didn't smoke, this confirmed later by friends and co-workers. Back at the house, Mixon asked Elaine if anyone else came around often. She shook her head, saying only the pastor and a few church ladies. Did he have enemies? No. Thomas was kind, everyone liked him. That afternoon, a search team was mobilized, tracking dogs, motorboats, a few volunteers paddling along the riverbank. The Combahee flowed sluggishly, covered in red-tinged silt. Metal detectors swept the shore for clues, beeping faintly at bits of scrap iron. A helicopter buzzed overhead, reporters' lenses zooming on the brown water. All of Beaufort followed the news on the radio. Local engineer missing under mysterious circumstances. No trace found yet. That evening, Mixon returned to the Reed house for more questions. Elaine had changed clothes, hair neatly pinned up, calm to an eerie degree. He scanned the living room, wedding frame on the shelf, scented candles, everything too clean. Are you sure Thomas didn't mention plans to go away to anyone? No, he just said he was tired lately. Maybe he wanted a few days alone. Mixon asked slowly, any issues between you two recently? Elaine forced a smile, just normal marital stuff, nothing big. He nodded, but noted in his book, no emotional display, defensive demeanor. 2 days later, search results came back empty. No body, no other personal items. A fisherman reported seeing truck headlights on the night Thomas vanished, at a side path to the highway, but couldn't recall the license plate. The paper mill confirmed he hadn't returned for a night shift. No one saw him after leaving the plant at 9 p.m. A co-worker whispered to police that Thomas was reviewing accounting records, suspecting fund misappropriation. But no one knew if he'd discussed it with anyone outside the company. Mixon called a brief meeting at the station. No corpse, no clear signs of crime, he said, tapping the table rhythmically. But I don't buy this as just a runaway. An officer suggested, maybe Thomas had an accident, slipped into the river. Mixon fell silent. He'd handled hundreds of missing persons cases, but something about this one gnawed at him. Too neat, too quiet. At the end, he stood over the map spread on the table, finger tracing the path from the Reed house to the dock, then stopping at the small bend leading to the St. Helena swamp. He drew a red circle. That night, Beaufort rained again. On the radio, a brief update: police continue searching for engineer Thomas Reed, missing 3 days. Case currently shows no criminal evidence. In the wooden house by the river, Elaine sat alone in a chair, the yellowish table lamp casting on her serene face. Outside, wind rustled the reeds, carrying the soft slap of water against the bank, steady, muffled, like the heartbeat of the swamp, still holding tight to everything it had swallowed. The search expanded in the following days, as Beaufort awoke amid the sweltering July heat and the suffocating atmosphere of unease. Sheriff Harold Mixon called in additional personnel from the neighboring Carleton County, setting up a field command post right in the parking lot near the Combahee Bridge. Motorboats cut through the water from early morning, groups of volunteers in orange life jackets sweeping along both riverbanks, holding iron hooks and binoculars in hand. K-9 units sniffed along the wind direction, sometimes barking loudly, then falling silent, leaving only the lapping waves and the droning cicadas. News spread quickly. Police call on residents to assist in search for missing engineer. On the main road, a small sign was erected with Thomas Reed's photo, a square face, straightforward and kind eyes, now the symbol of a disappearance that had the whole town on edge. The dive team from Charleston arrived, diving along the dock, where Thomas usually moored his boat. They only found a few pieces of rotted wood, some empty beer cans, and an old hat covered in seaweed, not his. Small sled helicopters buzzed across the sky, cameras scanning the muddy brown water below, sending back grainy images like scratches on old film. By noon, the temperature climbed near 100 degrees, thick steam rising from the swamps forcing everyone to take a break. Elaine Reed arrived at the scene, bringing cold water and towels for the search teams. She bowed her head in prayer when the local pastor came to visit, her face strangely calm. A WSCB reporter filmed her, hands clasped tightly, tears welling up as she said, "I just want him home, even if it's just so I can bury him in peace." On the fourth day, the search perimeter extended all the way to the river's bend, emptying into St. Helena Sound, the vast swamp area combed through, but nothing turned up. Mixon, exhausted, sat by the bank, staring at the oil slick on the water and the small fish swimming around, slowly telling his deputy, if he fell in the river, he'd have floated up by now. In his mind, the little details began to align: camel filter cigarette butts, a piece of green corduroy fabric, mud skid marks. All trivial, but together they formed a strange feeling. This wasn't an accident. He decided to question Elaine more thoroughly. That afternoon, Elaine came to the station in a dark dress, hair pinned up high, her demeanor prim and proper. Mixon asked about Thomas's .38 revolver, the one neighbors had seen him carrying on night fishing trips. She replied, "I sold it years ago after he lost it." Her voice steady, no tremor. Mixon pressed, "Do you know anyone who smokes Camel filters?" "No, Thomas never smoked." "I know," Mixon said, looking straight into her eyes. She lowered her head slightly, hands clenching together, then said, "Sir, I have nothing to hide." The interrogation ended, but as she left, he noticed dried mud caught on the hem of her dress. That evening, the rescue team decided to halt the river search and focus on the swamp area. Spotlights swept across, casting shadows of people and trees onto the water. The incessant hum of insects and the heavy smell of mud made everyone feel uneasy. A young officer, packing up gear, muttered quietly, "Feels like he doesn't want to be found." Mixon overheard but said nothing. He looked up, seeing low clouds skimming the water, gray-black blending into the sky. Beaufort's night was thick with humidity, frog croaks echoing from afar like a slow drum beat. By midnight, the search was called off. In the darkness, the sheriff stood silently watching the river flow, feeling that something had fallen here, heavy and quiet as a secret the swamp wouldn't easily give back. 2 weeks passed since Thomas Reed's disappearance. The search boats pulled ashore, the yellow tape taken down, and the town of Beaufort gradually returned to its old rhythm. But for Sheriff Harold Mixon, the case wouldn't leave his mind. Every morning, he still drove past the Reed house on his way to the station, seeing Elaine's silhouette watering the garden, her slender figure and serene face no different from a wife, still waiting for her husband to return. Mixon knew he didn't have enough evidence to call this a murder, but the small pieces in his head still didn't fit. A disappearance with no trace, no clues, no body, leaving only a terrifying silence. The press started losing interest in the story. The townsfolk spun their own versions. Some said Thomas had run off with a lover, a young accountant from the mill. Others claimed he was in debt and had fled. But when Mixon checked Reed's bank accounts, he discovered several strange withdrawals after Thomas vanished. All signed Thomas Reed. The handwriting looked right, but the paperwork showed the checks cashed at a branch just a few miles from Beaufort, a place the missing man had never been seen. When he asked, Elaine explained that her husband had pre-signed the checks, and she was just continuing to use them to pay bills. The explanation sounded reasonable, but what caught Mixon's attention more was her tone when she said it, not a hint of hesitation, no fear in her eyes. A week later, Mixon went to the paper mill in Georgetown. In Thomas's old office, he met Eddie Carter, the victim's close colleague. Carter said that a few weeks before vanishing, Thomas had quietly mentioned numbers that didn't add up in the administrative department's ledgers. He said he'd file a report with the director, but I never saw one, Carter said, his voice dropping. That night, he took his briefcase home, said he'd review it one last time there. That briefcase was never found. Mixon noted it carefully, his suspicion growing. If Thomas was really planning to expose company fraud, someone might have wanted him silenced. But if so, why no signs of a struggle, and why hadn't the body turned up? Back in Beaufort, He took the green corduroy fabric and camel filter butts to the Columbia lab for testing. The report said the fabric was typically used in 1979 Chevy truck seats, mossy green, a rare color in the area. The butts were confirmed as camel filters, but DNA couldn't be traced with the technology of the time. Only one notable detail: the butts had been extinguished with pale pink lipstick. When Mixon read that, he gripped the report tightly. There was no way to prove anything, but it made him think of Elaine, always appearing so perfect, gentle and proper to the point of seeming unreal. He invited her to the station again, but this time just to update on the investigation progress. Elaine arrived, bringing cookies for the staff, smiling thanks to everyone for their help. Mixon asked her about the briefcase Thomas had taken home the night he disappeared. She hesitated a bit, then replied, "I didn't see it, maybe he left it at the mill." The answer puzzled Mixon, since according to Carter, Thomas always brought it home. He tried, "Could I take another look at your car? I remember you drove a green Chevy." Elaine nodded slightly, saying she'd sold it last year, to a guy in Walterboro. "I didn't keep in touch." As she left, Mixon stood looking out the window, watching her sedan's shadow fade behind the pine grove. He knew the case was sinking, the file soon to be closed for insufficient evidence of crime. But deep down, he didn't believe Thomas Reed had simply vanished. Before turning off the office light, he opened his notebook, writing a short line at the bottom of the page. "This silence is too perfect. Someone is hiding something." Then he closed the book, leaving the pen diagonally across the page, like a promise that he'd come back, even if time faded everything. Early in 1981, the file on Thomas Reed's disappearance was placed in the storage cabinet at the Beaufort police station, marked with a brief line, "No evidence of crime found." The media storm died down, the newspapers that once ran Thomas's photo now wrapping fish at the market, and the townsfolk returned to their daily rhythm, as if the disappearance were just a sad chapter from the previous summer. Sheriff Harold Mixon still kept his own file, thick as a palm, but he knew he couldn't prolong the investigation without new evidence. His superiors wanted him focused on more pressing cases, and the budget for the search team had run dry. On the night he closed the file, Mixon sat late in the office, watching rain patter on the window frame. Outside, the street light shone down on the faded sign reading Beaufort Police, the light flickering like the feeling inside him, something unfinished, but forced to be shelved. As for Elaine, her life seemed to return to normal faster than anyone expected. Every morning, she still backed the car out of the driveway, heading to work at the souvenir shop on Bay Street, smiling at everyone, as if her husband's disappearance were just a faded memory. At the Baptist church, she took on fundraisers for charity, reading scripture at prayer meetings. People looked at her with eyes full of pity and admiration, the abandoned woman who kept her faith, still graceful and kind. The condolences cards stuck on the fridge were gradually replaced by handwritten thank you notes from Elaine. "Thank you for praying for Thomas and my family." In this small town, time was enough for people to forgive what they didn't understand. In March, the WSCB reporter did a final news segment on the case. A brief wrap-up. Beaufort police confirmed no criminal developments in engineer Thomas Reed's disappearance. Official file temporarily closed. A short emotionless sentence, but to Mixon, it was like a cold iron bolt locking away what he hadn't dared believe. He folded the newspaper and put it in a drawer. The first unsolved case of his career. In the months that followed, Elaine started being spoken of with a lighter tone. "Poor thing, he must have really left her," the barber shop owner said. "She's strong, still goes to church every week." By fall, she was even chosen to lead the church women's group. Her composure made everyone think time had healed the wound. But sometimes, neighbors living along the riverbank said they saw Elaine standing a long time on the porch at night, gazing out toward the Combahee, where thick fog blanketed the water. Once Mrs. Martha Sanders, who lived across the street, told her husband, "She looks like she's watching for someone to come back." As for Mixon, even after closing the file, he kept the area map folded into quarters in his desk drawer. Whenever he passed the river bend, where the rescue team had once dropped buoys, he'd slow the car, eyeing the brown water hidden under the reeds. Sometimes he wondered if digging deeper might uncover something at the bottom. But he also understood that in Beaufort, the swamp had its own way of holding on to what it wanted. A year passed, and Thomas Reed's disappearance officially became old news, leaving only a quiet void in the memories of those who had searched for him. Mixon added a final line to his notebook before putting it away. "No body, no crime. But this silence, I'll never believe." In the years that followed, Beaufort changed gradually. The main street widened, the Gaylord paper mill in Georgetown scaled back and then shut down, leaving behind rusted warehouses and the faint scent of old pulp still lingering in the wind. The 1980s passed, then the 1990s, and Thomas Reed's disappearance became a dim story, only occasionally mentioned in gatherings of longtime residents. That engineer from the Reed house, he must have gone off somewhere far away, poor thing's wife. Elaine stayed in the riverfront house, repainting the white walls, planting more jasmine bushes out front. She worked part-time at the local library, joined the church group, and gradually became the most respected woman in the neighborhood. With her hair graying early and her gentle voice, Elaine was the epitome of Southern patience, always polite, rarely talking about herself. Every July she placed a small bouquet by the old dock, telling acquaintances it was to remember Thomas wherever he is. Sheriff Harold Mixon had retired since 1986, with snow-white hair. He moved to a small house near Bluffton, still keeping the habit of rereading old files on rainy evenings. In the wooden cabinet, the file labeled Reed, Thomas, missing, 1,980 inches remained intact, its edges yellowed. Many times, he meant to throw it out, but each time he opened it, he saw his own last note, "No body, no crime." That phrase haunted him, as if he'd missed something. Sometimes, he drove back to Beaufort, stopping by the Combahee Bridge, gazing at the flat river flowing through, and wondering, if Thomas really fell in there, why the marsh never gave back the body. In town, the young people who grew up only heard Thomas's name as a whisper from the past. They looked at Elaine with gentle respect, Mrs. Reed, the woman whose husband left her but still kept her faith. She never remarried, living simply, with few close friends. When the church needed donors for the meal program for the poor, Elaine was always there. Her image appeared in a 1992 local newspaper article titled, "Resilient Widow Helps the Community." The photo showed her smiling, holding a basket of baked goods, standing in front of a wooden sign with the Bible verse, "The truth will set you free." Few noticed how her hand gripped the edge of the basket, the knuckles white. Occasionally, someone claimed to have seen Thomas somewhere, a man around 50 driving through Savannah, or a figure like him at a gas station in Walterboro. But all were vague, with no real evidence. By 1999, when the Beaufort Gazette ran a feature Unsolved Disappearances of the Lowcountry, Thomas Reed's case took only half a small page, sandwiched between ads for used boats. The article closed with "Many believe he's still alive, perhaps out there somewhere." Elaine was interviewed, saying in a light voice, "If he's alive, I hope he's at peace." No one noticed the flicker in her eyes, something colder than sadness, a glint of wariness, as if she were keeping watch so the past would never return. That decade, Beaufort grew with new generations, but the memory of Thomas's disappearance lingered like the dampness clinging to marsh grass roots. The old sheriff sometimes ran into Elaine at the supermarket. The two just nodded in greeting, neither mentioning the old story. When Mixon got home, he looked out at the river through the window, feeling that the southern night had the familiar smell of things left unsaid. That winter, he added a line to his old notebook, "A town may forget, but the marsh doesn't." In the spring of 2018, Harold Mixon was 82, living quietly in his small house in Bluffton, nearly an hour's drive from Beaufort. His living room was flooded with pale golden light, On the shelf were still the old commendations from his sheriff days. Honest and dedicated service to the community. Next to them was the thin brown folder, its spine frayed, set apart like a habit he could never quit. It was the file on Thomas Reed's disappearance, the only case in his career that kept him from sleeping soundly. That morning, Mixon brewed coffee, turned on the radio for the news, and when the announcer mentioned cold cases being reopened by the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED, using DNA techniques, he suddenly sat up straight. That phrase, cold case reopened, rang like a bell in his dust-covered memory. He looked out at the yard, where pine branches swayed in the wind, and felt something long dormant stir to life in his chest. He pulled out the file, flipping through the yellowed pages, the scene report, the photo of the dock, the scrap of blue corduroy fabric, and the Camel filter cigarette butt taped in a small nylon bag. Those tiny pieces of evidence had kept him up many nights. He remembered the rainy night in 1980, standing on the Reed porch, the flashlight beam sweeping over the river's surface, and the smell of mud mixed with a faint perfume in the wind. "Where did I go wrong?" he muttered. Over 40 years, he'd tried many times to convince his superiors to reopen the case, but everyone said there was nothing left to find. No body, no evidence, no crime, they said. He'd almost let it go, but every time he passed the Combahee Bridge, he still looked down at that murky brown water. The old question echoing in his head, why so quiet? That day Mixon called an old friend at the SLED office in Columbia, mentioning the news he'd just heard. On the other end was a raspy laugh. "You still remember that one? Lord, 40 years ago. But you know, the kids now have new tech, genealogy DNA. Sometimes they even find distant relatives." The friend said half jokingly, half seriously, "Send that file up here, I'll have the youngsters take a look." Mixon was silent for a moment, then agreed. That night, he sat back at the table, writing a short handwritten letter with the old file. In it, he wrote, "This case has slept for 4 decades. If there's a chance, please wake it up." When he folded the file shut, he looked out the window, seeing the sunset red streaking the river, just like the sky that night he first searched for Thomas Reed's body. He knew he didn't have much time left, but a small faith he'd held through decades, as a cop remained. The marsh couldn't hide secrets forever. It just waited for the right person to come back. Mixon set the envelope on the table, weighed down by his cold coffee mug, then leaned back in his chair. Outside, the frogs croaked steadily with the evening breeze. He closed his eyes, his heart a little lighter, as if finally, after 40 years, he'd found the path back to the case that never left his mind. In October 2019, at the SLED office in Columbia, the lights in the cold case room cast a white glow on rows of steel cabinets stacked to the ceiling. Ava Colson, the young investigator just 32, was reviewing the list of unsolved disappearances assigned to her for re-examination in the old files recovery program. Amid hundreds of faded name files, she noticed a thin one clipped in old brown cardboard, handwritten in black ink slanted, "Reed, Thomas, missing 1980, Beaufort County." Clipped to the cover was another yellowed paper with a shaky line, "If there's a chance, please wake this case up. H. Mixon." Ava lightly touched the ink, feeling the urgency of someone who'd come before. She took the file to her desk, turned on the desk lamp, and immersed herself in the handwritten reports from nearly 4 decades ago. In the file, everything was preserved almost perfectly: the sketch of the Reed house layout, the black and white photo of the dock with the mud skid marks, a nylon bag holding the blue corduroy scrap, and the Camel filter butt. At the back was Sheriff Mixon's note, "No body, no crime. But this quiet isn't trustworthy." Ava read that line over and over, then leaned back in her chair, her eyes lingering on the photo of the young man in mill coveralls, his smile faint as mist. "He deserves to hear the answer," she whispered. In recent years, Ava had joined the genealogy DNA analysis team, a new technology that could identify missing persons by matching old genetic samples to family ancestry databases. If Thomas Reed's bones were still somewhere, perhaps they were waiting for her. She contacted the SLED evidence vault, requesting the remaining samples from the 1980 Beaufort case be transferred to the analysis lab. When the cardboard box was opened, the smell of old paper and nylon rushed out, carrying the feel of touching a memory. The technician sampled the fabric scrap, the cigarette butt, and a rusted metal button, noted as found near the dock. Ava stood nearby, carefully noting every detail, knowing current tech could extract DNA from even the tiniest traces. Then she called the victim's sister, Margaret Reed, now living in Charleston, to ask if she'd be willing to provide a reference DNA sample. On the other end, the elderly woman's voice trembled. "I've waited for this call for 40 years. Take as much as you need, just so I know where my brother is." In the weeks that followed, Ava interviewed old witnesses one by one. Many were elderly, some had passed away, but fragmented memories remained. Mrs. Martha Sanders, the neighbor across from the Reed house, recalled, "That night, I heard something like a pop, then a truck speeding off. But who doesn't have a truck around here?" A former mechanic named Eddie Carter told her that Thomas had brought home a pair of ledgers with the paper mill's black books accounting, and they vanished with him. Ava noted it all, old details that once seemed meaningless, starting to form the hazy outline of a truth long covered up. Each evening, after everyone left the office, Ava stayed at her desk, the yellow lamplight shining on the old Beaufort map she'd pinned to the wall. She circled the Reed house area in red pen, then drew a line out to the Combahee River, where Mixon's old mud-streaked note was marked. The words St. Helena Marshes were bolded. Below she added a line, like a promise to herself, "If he's still lying somewhere in the marsh, I'll find him." And in that moment, Ava felt the boundary between past and present grow thin, as if the 1980 rain were still falling outside the window, and Harold Mixon's flashlight beam were still sweeping the river's surface, just waiting for a younger hand to pick up the unfinished journey. In June 2024, Hurricane Helene swept through the South Carolina coast, bringing gusty winds and torrential rain. As the storm dissipated, the St. Helena marshes were flooded, the ground subsided, and small river bends changed course. 3 weeks later, when a crew was sent to dredge the drainage canal along the old road near the Combahee Bridge, they discovered something unusual, a piece of blue plastic tarp emerging from the mud. At first, they thought it was trash, but when they dug it up, the tarp tore open to reveal white bone fragments entangled in cattail roots. The excavator operator immediately stopped, calling the police. Within hours, the area was cordoned off. Sled vehicles and the Columbia forensics team arrived quickly. The thick mud, the stench of stagnant water and decaying algae filled the air. Amid the hazy floodlights, they carefully peeled back layers of soil, discovering a tarnished silver ring lying close to the skeletal frame. Inside, clearly engraved, TR 1977, the news spread faster than the storm winds. WDSCB radio aired an urgent bulletin. A set of skeletal remains has been found in the St. Helena marshes. Authorities say it may be connected to the 1980 disappearance of engineer Thomas Reed. In Charleston, Margaret Reed heard the news from her nephew and nearly dropped the phone. Meanwhile, Ava Colson, who had been pursuing the old case file for 5 years, was immediately summoned to the scene. As she stepped onto the rain-soaked ground, the gray sky reflected in the marsh puddles, Ava felt like she was stepping into the memory of the case itself. The cattails swayed, the wind carrying the sound of machinery and the smell of rust. She knelt beside the excavation pit, closely examining the remnants of the old, mostly decayed plastic tarp, beneath which lay a partially shattered skull, still mixed with blue corduroy fabric. A forensics technician whispered, "It looks like he was wrapped up and dumped here. This mud has kept everything intact for 40 years. Ava nodded, her heart pounding. She knew that if the DNA in the bones was sufficient, this could be the breakthrough in a case that all of Beaufort had forgotten. 2 days later, the remains were transported to the State Forensics Lab in Columbia. Cervical and rib bones were selected for DNA extraction, a meticulous process that took several weeks. Meanwhile, the crime scene analysis team discovered a small rusted lead bullet lodged between two rocks in the mud. Its trajectory and caliber suggested a .38 round, matching the type of handgun Elaine Reed had once reported as lost years earlier. The technician also found a piece of leather belt and a buckle faintly stamped with GRM, Georgetown Mill, the logo of the factory where Thomas had worked. Those details began to piece together the picture that Harold Mixon had once intuited. This was no disappearance. When the preliminary DNA results arrived at the SLED office, Ava personally received the sealed envelope. The brief conclusion made her heart clench. Results matched 99.98% with Margaret Reed's sample. She stood frozen in the room, the hum of the air conditioner overhead, feeling both stunned and relieved. After nearly half a century, they had found him. She called Margaret right away. On the other end, the elderly woman was silent for a long time, then burst into tears. "Thank you, finally my brother can come home." Ava didn't know what else to say, but a promise, "We'll find out what happened." The next day the Beaufort County Sheriff held a press conference. Behind him was a whiteboard with large letters, Case 1980D042, identification confirmed. Dozens of reporters crowded in, lenses aimed at the ring, and an old photo of Thomas Reed placed on the table. "We have reason to believe this is a homicide," the sheriff said slowly. "We're coordinating with SLED to determine the cause of death and identify suspects." In Beaufort, the older residents began recounting old memories, the name Thomas Reed returning to their lips after more than 40 years of silence. On the local station's social media, hundreds of comments appeared. "Oh God, I still remember him. So he didn't just leave." That evening, Ava drove along the road leading to the Combahee River, stopping at the small bridge where Sheriff Mixon had once stood in 1980. The faint moon shone down on the brown water, reflecting her shadow like that of someone conversing with the past. She whispered softly, almost for the wind to hear, "We've found you, Thomas. Now it's my turn to find out who made you stay here." The wind skimmed the river's surface, carrying the smell of mud, and for a moment, Ava thought she heard something distant, a old train whistle, or the sigh of the man whose fate had just been named after 44 years. The forensics lab in Columbia glowed with white lights, the air thick with the mix of alcohol and fresh metal. Steel tables lined up in rows, topped with meticulously numbered bone trays, fractured ribs, a shard of shattered skull, and the silver ring, 1977, placed beside them in a glass case. Ava Colson stood behind the observation glass, watching the technicians in white protective suits work on the cleaned bone samples. Dr. Leah Watson, the lead forensic pathologist, slipped on her gloves and explained, "We extracted both nuclear and mitochondrial DNA. The results match the sister, but there's something more important. The rib bone has a clean round puncture, with charred edges. This isn't a natural mark, it's a bullet wound. Mr. Reed was shot at very close range." Ava shivered slightly, her fingers tapping lightly on the glass. Under the lights, the skeleton seemed to hold a silent story, one not yet complete. Leah set the bone tray down, opened her laptop, and displayed more data. The bullet estimated as a .38, special, compatible with common firearms from the 1970s, 80s. The remaining clothing clung to the shoulder bones, the fabric matching the Gaylord factory uniform that Thomas had worn every day. On that fabric, they also discovered a woman's hair fiber caught between layers, large enough for DNA sequencing. When the results appeared on the screen, Leah looked at Ava. "We compared it to the Reed family DNA samples in the database. That hair doesn't belong to the victim or any relatives." Ava fell silent, but in her mind, two words immediately echoed, Elaine Reed. She recalled the old case files, including Elaine's statement, "We went to bed early, and in the morning, he was gone." Back then, police had no way to prove it false. Now the physical evidence told a different story. If he was shot in the house, Ava said quietly, why was he wrapped in a tarp and dumped in the marsh? Someone wanted him gone completely. Leah nodded. The mud preserved almost everything intact. It's soil that remembers. The word sent a chill down Ava's spine. That afternoon, she returned to Beaufort with the team, carrying the preliminary report. They met Margaret Reed again, in her small Charleston apartment, to relay the results. The elderly woman gripped Ava's hand tightly when she heard the word bullet. She was silent for a long time, then said, "I knew it. My brother would never leave. He was afraid of water, hated rivers. I told the police, but no one believed me." Ava didn't know how to respond, only bowing her head. As she left the apartment, she heard Margaret softly reciting a prayer, her voice trembling but resolute, as if speaking to her departed brother's soul. On the way back, Ava stopped at the Combahee Bridge, where the river still flowed silently, as it had years ago. She parked, stepped out, and watched the late afternoon sun shine on the reddish-brown water. The wind from the marsh carried the smell of mud and the chirp of insects, making her feel like she was hearing the breath of time again. In her mind, the case details gradually sharpened: the gunshot at 11 p.m., the departing truck, the blue corduroy fabric, and now the bullet. Everything was starting to close the circle. She pulled out her phone, opened her notes, and wrote one line: "Not a disappearance murder." That evening, in her small office in Columbia, Ava reread Harold Mixon's old handwritten letter that she kept in her drawer. "If you get the chance, please wake this case up." She smiled sadly, feeling like the old sheriff somewhere far away was watching over her. Under the desk lamp, the forensics report closed with bold print: cause of death, close-range gunshot wound penetrating the chest. Manner, homicide. Science had spoken, and memory was beginning to answer. After the forensics results confirmed Thomas Reed was shot to death, Ava Colson knew the next step couldn't rely on intuition. She needed a chain of hard evidence that could hold up in court. The case was now officially classified as homicide, and the entire file transferred to SLED's Special Cold Case DNA Resolution Program. The first morning after the report, Ava sat before her computer screen, reopening the financial file she had skimmed back in 2019. The line "Thomas Reed, account #4476, appeared in the Beaufort Credit Union bank account list. She zoomed in on the screen, scrutinizing the microfilmed check copies, and noticed something irregular: several checks signed Thomas Reed, dated from 1981 to 1987, years after he vanished. The ink signature varied, the strokes stiff and lacking pressure, as if someone was trying to imitate it. She immediately printed all the copies, stacked them, and began comparing them to the real signature in the Gaylord factory personnel file. The more she compared, the clearer the differences became. The questionable check's handwriting slanted to the right, while Thomas's real signature was straight and even. A handwriting expert confirmed: high likelihood of forgery. Ava had the bank records department check the check depositors, and the results stunned her. The depositor and cash withdrawer for most transactions was Elaine Reed. In the transaction notes, the name of the souvenir shop where she worked appeared multiple times, meaning this money was spent openly, yet in the name of the missing man. She brought the entire file to meet Prosecutor Jack Hendricks in Beaufort. He scanned each page, then looked up slowly, and said, "If these checks were really written after 1980, we can charge forgery and embezzlement. But more importantly, it shows motive." Ava nodded, her heart racing. "Thomas's life insurance," she said. "He had a $50,000 policy signed in 1977. If he died, Elaine was the beneficiary." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Ava presented the old contract found in the Gaylord Mill archives. Stamped claim paid 1985, signed by Elaine Reed. Hendricks set the paper down on the desk, exhaling. She collected the money nearly 5 years after her husband disappeared, when police had stopped investigating. That means she knew he wasn't alive. But one other detail nagged at Ava. In the factory records, Thomas had handled accounting audits, and had access to maintenance fund data. An internal memo showed he had discovered a shortfall of over $10,000, coinciding with Elaine's part-time work in the factory's admin department. Ava wondered if Thomas had uncovered someone involved, possibly his own wife. When she visited the old factory, now just a crumbling concrete shell, a retired security guard recalled, "I once saw the couple arguing fiercely in their car in the parking lot, right before Mr. Reed disappeared. He was yelling, she was crying, but no one intervened." That evening, in her small Columbia office, Ava spread all the documents across the table: the forensics report, forged checks, insurance contract, and witness statements. On the wall, an old photo of Thomas was pinned amid red strings connecting to note papers. A straight line led to a photo of Elaine Reed, taken at a 1995 charity event, her face still gentle and eyes serene. But beneath that serenity, Ava saw a repeating question: how could a woman live peacefully for 40 years beside a lie? She turned on the recorder, speaking softly into it. "Financial evidence indicates Elaine Reed had economic motive, access opportunity, and reason to eliminate her husband. Next step, match the hair DNA found with Elaine's sample." When she turned off the machine, Ava looked out the window. The streetlight reflected on the desk, touching the TR 1977 ring in its sealed bag. The old metal gleamed faintly, hazy yet persistent, like the truth itself gradually awakening after 4 decades of concealment. On the afternoon of August 15, 2024, Ava Colson drove to the wooden house by the Combahee River, where the faded sign Reed Residence still hung crookedly on the porch. The house looked almost unchanged after 40 years, white painted walls slightly peeling, the jasmine trellis still covering the windows, and the wind from the swamp blowing through carrying the smell of water mixed with the scent of wilted flowers. Elaine Reed, now 70 years old, opened the door to greet her. The petite woman wore a light blue dress, her silver hair tied neatly, her eyes bright, and her smile so soft that if you didn't know beforehand, Ava would hardly believe she was the central figure in a murder case. "Are you Miss Colson?" Elaine asked softly, her voice low but steady. "I knew this day would come sooner or later. Come in." Ava sat down on the old wooden chair in the living room, where everything was arranged so neatly it bordered on impersonal. A frame of Thomas placed squarely on the shelf, a new scented candle, pristine white curtains. She pulled out her recorder and set it on the table. "Mrs. Reed, I'd like to talk again about your husband's disappearance in 1980. Elaine nodded, her eyes not leaving the frame of her husband. "I've told everything to the police already, many times. Thomas left the house that night and never came back." Ava flipped open her notebook and read slowly. "The new forensic report shows he was shot at close range, and the body was found in the swamp after 44 years. Can you help me understand what happened?" Elaine was silent for a very long time, her hand lightly stroking the edge of her dress. "I don't know, maybe someone from the factory harmed him." Her voice remained even, but her throat swallowed dryly. Ava pulled out a photocopy of the checks and gently pushed it toward her. "These checks bear Thomas's signature, but they were signed from 1981 to 1987. Can you explain that?" Elaine glanced at it briefly, pursing her lips. "He left pre-signed checks. I just used them to pay bills. I didn't think there was anything wrong." Ava continued, her voice slower. "And the life insurance policy. You received the payout in 1985, after the case was closed. At that time, were you sure your husband was still alive?" Elaine sighed, turning her gaze out the window, where the water sparkled in the sunlight. I just did what the agent told me. I've lived alone too long, you see." Ava let the silence pass, then pulled out a small evidence bag containing a photo of the hair found on the victim's shirt fabric. "We have the DNA comparison results. It matches a sample of your hair." This time, Elaine trembled slightly. The teacup in her hand tilted, warm drops falling onto the table. "Mrs. Reed," Ava said, her voice softer but firm, "I'm not here to accuse you. I'm here to hear your story, before it's told by someone else." Elaine looked up, her gaze sharper. "Do you believe in God?" she asked suddenly. Ava hesitated briefly. "I believe in the truth." Elaine smiled faintly, her dry lips trembling slightly. "The truth," she repeated, "is something people can't bear when it comes too late. I've spent my whole life believing I was forgiven. But if you found his bones, then surely God wanted it that way. The air in the room grew thick, only the ticking of the clock remaining. Elaine stood up, gathering the broken teacup, her voice soft. "I'm tired now, Miss Coulson. You'll need a subpoena to talk further." As she stepped into the hallway, light from the window fell on the wedding photo hanging on the wall. Thomas smiling, his arm around his wife's shoulders, the background the sparkling Combahee River. Ava watched her go, a strange feeling rising in her chest between pity and anger. She turned off the recorder, stood up, and glanced around the room one more time. Everything was clean and orderly, as if the past 40 years had been nothing but a perfectly staged deception. As she stepped onto the porch, the wind from the swamp blew through, carrying warm moisture and the scent of wilted jasmine, the smell of memories that still wouldn't rest. 2 weeks after that interview, the SLED investigation room was like a beehive buzzing day and night. Ava Coulson and her team poured all their effort into piecing together the scattered fragments. Departments sent back new forensic reports. The DNA on the camel filter cigarette butt matched perfectly with the hair sample from Elaine Reed that Ava had obtained via search warrant. On the tarp wrapping the body, they discovered additional traces of silver blue paint, analysis confirming it was the exact type used on 1979 Chevy trucks, matching the vehicle Elaine had once owned and claimed to have sold years ago. In the DMV archives, Ava traced the registration records that Chevy had never been legally sold. The transfer papers were just a handwritten copy, without the buyer's signature. She sat silently staring at the screen, feeling like the entire case was folding in around a single name. The ballistics report arrived at the same time. The bullet lodged in Thomas's bone was re-examined with a 3D scanner, confirming rifling consistent with the Smith & Wesson .38 Special Revolver Group. In the old files, Thomas had once owned such a gun, but after his disappearance, Elaine said it had gone missing during a move. No missing gun report was found. When Ava presented the results to prosecutor Jack Hendricks, he looked at her for a long time and said, "If we get an eyewitness or one final piece of evidence, we have enough for an arrest warrant." Ava nodded, knowing she was at the final threshold of a 4-decade journey. She decided to return to Beaufort, following the trail of the Chevy truck. An old mechanic in Walterboro, Raymond Cole, vaguely remembered, around early 1981, a woman brought in a blue Chevy to have the seats reupholstered because the fabric was torn and stained with something like dried blood. I asked if she wanted to change the fabric. She said just to cover it with a new layer of upholstery on top. He only remembered a faint whiff of perfume, the same scent Ava had smelled in the Riverside house. She recorded his statement, a chill running down her spine. The blue upholstery fabric, the bullet, the cigarette ash, all like faint paths leading to the same point. The July night in 1980, when she presented the supplemental case file to the state prosecutor's board, the meeting lasted 3 hours in a windowless conference room. Each piece of evidence was projected on the screen: photos of the ring, the dock image, DNA results, vehicle paint report, bank statements, and the new witness testimony. Each small detail seemed isolated, but when placed correctly, they formed a seamless story: a night of argument, a gunshot, a cover-up plan, and 40 years of pretending to be the victim. When the presentation ended, Hendricks was silent for a moment, and then said, "She lived off his death. Now it's time he has a voice." That evening, Ava returned to her small hotel in Beaufort, and opened the window overlooking the river. Night rain fell lightly, droplets hitting the glass like the steady beat of time. She spread the printouts across the bed, marking the final connections: upholstery fabric, Chevy truck, Elaine cigarette ash, female DNA, bullet missing .38 gun, finances, insurance and forged checks. It all fit together so perfectly, it was terrifying. In the dim light, she reread the old handwritten letter from Harold Mixon. "If you get the chance, please wake this case up." Now the case wasn't just awakened, it was screaming in the language of science, of irrefutable evidence. Ava packed the case file into her bag, feeling the river's moisture seeping into the air. She knew tomorrow would be a completely different morning, when justice was no longer a hypothesis on paper. The wind from the swamp carried the smell of mud and wet grass, slipping through the door crack like the breath of the departed. She whispered to herself, "We've pieced your story together, Thomas. Now it's time to tell it to the world." And out there, under the thin rain, the yellow streetlight shone on the river's surface, sparkling like 1,000 fragments of memory being reassembled, fitting down to the very last detail. On the morning of August 22, 2024, as the sun just rose above the mangrove trees in Beaufort, the atmosphere in the SLED office was thick to the point of suffocating. After weeks of interagency meetings, the state prosecutors had officially signed the arrest warrant for Elaine Reed on charges of second-degree murder and concealment of a body. Ava Colson was assigned to lead the execution team. The warrant bore the decisive printed words, a red seal stamped over the name Elaine Marie Reed, 70 years old. She stared at those words for a long time, feeling both heavy and relieved. Nearly half a century later, the final circle had closed. At 10 a.m., the police convoy quietly left headquarters, blue and red lights not yet flashing, heading toward the small house by the Combahee River, where it all began. On the drive, the sky was misty, moisture rising from the swamp, making the scene like an old film replaying. When they arrived, Elaine was watering plants on the porch, wearing a white shirt and khaki pants, her silver hair loosely down. She looked up when she saw the black cars crawling slowly down the gravel road. An officer stepped forward and read every word of the warrant clearly. Elaine stood still holding the watering can, then gently set it down, asking nothing, resisting nothing. "I knew this day would come," she said in a calm voice, her eyes meeting Ava's directly. "Just hope you do it by the book." Ava nodded. She extended her hands before they could ask, her thin dry wrists trembling slightly as the cold cuffs clicked on. Neighbors began to gather, some on their porches, some in windows. No one spoke loudly, just fragmented whispers. "Oh my God, Mrs. Reed, it can't be." The elderly Baptist church pastor leaned on her cane by the roadside, tears streaming as she watched the woman who had read scripture every week being led away. The scene was like a shattered mirror, the image of Beaufort's model wife crumbling before the community that had revered her for 40 years. As the police car door closed, the lights reflected on the distant Combahee River water, and a soft siren wail sounded like a farewell to a long-held illusion. In the car, Ava sat facing Elaine. No one spoke the entire way. Only when the car left the bridge did Elaine finally speak, very softly. "I did everything to keep the peace. Now it's over." Ava looked out the window, sunlight slanting through the trees, casting deep wrinkles on her face like cracks of time. "Do you want to say anything more before your lawyer arrives?" "No," she replied, "but if you see Mr. Mixon, tell him I never hated Thomas. I was just afraid." Then she turned away, looking out at the river. At the Beaufort station, reporters crowded the gate. When the car door opened, camera flashes popped relentlessly, questions piling up. "Mrs. Reed, did you kill your husband? Mrs. Reed, where did you hide the body?" She didn't answer, just bowed her head, walking slowly inside step by step. That image immediately appeared on WSCB's noon news with the bold headline, "Arrest Shocks Community. The Widow of Combahee Charged in 1980 Murder." In the Bay Street coffee shop, locals watched and shook their heads. One man said quietly, "All my life I thought she was a good person." Another replied, "Who knows, in Beaufort the swamp hides more than we think." That afternoon, Ava submitted the final report to the prosecutor's office. Inside was the entire chain of evidence: DNA, finances, weapons, witnesses, arranged neatly and meticulously. As she signed the last line, her hand trembled, not from fear, but from relief. Outside, the sky was clearing, the wind from the swamp, carrying the damp water smell and jasmine, just like the night Thomas disappeared. Ava looked out at the fading daylight, silently thinking of Harold Mixon, the man who had started it all. He had once written, "The swamp can't keep secrets forever." Now, it had given back the truth, though it took 44 years and a foggy morning to do it. The news of Elaine Reed's arrest spread throughout Beaufort faster than any wind that had ever blown through this marshland. Just hours after WSCB aired the bulletin, photos of her in handcuffs flooded social media, stunning the peaceful residents of the small town. At the Bay Street Diner, where an old photo from 1995 hung showing Elaine handing out charity gifts, the owner stood silently staring at the TV screen. "I can't believe it," he said softly. "She once helped me pay for my mother's hospital bills." At the next table, a middle-aged woman sighed. "Maybe everyone has their dark side." The entire room weighed down with an indescribable silence. No one was glad for justice, only a sense of loss, as if the whole town had just lost something sacred. At the Baptist church, where Elaine had once taught women's Bible class, elderly Pastor Samuel Horton held a special prayer service. In the nave, golden candlelight flickered as he read from Matthew 10:26, "For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest, nor is anything secret that will not be known to all." Some bowed their heads in tears, others remained silent. His pastor's wife said quietly after the service, "We don't know whether to pray for Thomas's soul or for Elaine's salvation." Outside, wind from the river rustled through the old oak trees. Residents gathered in small groups, murmuring in confusion. "If she really did it, then for the past 40 years we've been living next to a sin without knowing it." The state's major newspapers began covering the story, calling it the case that makes South Carolina re-examine its faith. A TV report replayed footage of the Riverside house with a cold voiceover. A place once seen as a symbol of resilience now becomes the scene of deception. In Charleston, Margaret Reed refused interviews, only issuing a brief statement, "I harbor no hatred, but the truth needs to be spoken. My brother finally has a real name on his grave." As for Ava Colson, when asked about her feelings, she said only one thing: "Justice brings no joy, it only brings silence." Night fell, and the town of Beaufort sank into an eerie stillness. Under the pale yellow streetlights, the Elaine Reed Foundation sign in front of the church was taken down, leaning against the wall like a sorrowful piece of evidence. People returned home, but everyone carried a lingering unease about what else might be hidden beneath those calm waters. Wind from the marsh blew through, carrying humidity and the brackish smell of mud, reminding people that even the most peaceful places can swallow the deepest secrets, and that sometimes, when justice rises to the surface, it makes everyone bow their heads in silence. In September 2024, Beaufort entered the sweltering final days of summer, and while golden sunlight spilled over the low rooftops along Bay Street, the district attorney's office had begun preparing for Elaine Reed's trial, the case dubbed South Carolina's biggest cold case of the decade. Ava Colson spent most of her time in the records room in Columbia, combing through every detail to ensure no link was overlooked. On her desk were stacks of documents, DNA reports, mechanic Raymond Cole's testimony, evidence of forged checks, .38 caliber bullet reports, and even digitally reconstructed photos of Thomas Reed's crime scene body, all organized into folders, labeled in red pen. She knew that if even one detail was off, decades of effort would crumble to dust. Each night, after everyone had gone home, Ava still sat under the dim desk lamp, replaying the recording of Elaine's interrogation, pausing at her final words. "I never hated Thomas, I was just afraid." She wondered, afraid of what, the truth, or herself? In Beaufort, the atmosphere in preparation for the trial was taut as a bowstring. The county courthouse, a venerable red brick building, was repainted, fitted with security scanners and fences. Reporters from Columbia, Charleston and Savannah poured in, setting up tents and cameras at the gates. The press described the case as the fall of a Southern moral icon. Meanwhile, inside the jail, Elaine Reed maintained an unusually calm demeanor. Defense attorney Douglas Payne, a silver-haired man who had won many sensational cases, took her on as a client. He declared he would rely on a justifiable defense argument, that Thomas Reed was hot-tempered and may have attacked his wife, and the shooting was an accident. He also prepared psychological factors, Elaine was in crisis and fear, which led her to cover it up. On the prosecution side, Jack Hendricks, along with Ava and the investigators, planned a counterattack, reconstructing the entire sequence of the night of July 18, 1980, with new data. DNA evidence, car paint, ballistics, finances, witnesses, everything fitted together like interlocking gears. "We're not telling the story with emotions," Hendricks instructed, "but with facts." Ava nodded, opening the presentation slides, doc photos, mud skid marks, old blood stains on the car seat, a woman's hair strand. "We have everything except the gun," she said. Hendricks replied, "We don't need it. This whole world is the gun." In the Baptist church, the community remained divided. A small group believed Elaine was innocent, seeing her as a misunderstood sacrificial mother. Another group fully trusted the police conclusion. Every Sunday morning, as the pastor read the prayers, the names Thomas and Elaine echoed in the same breath, both victim and sinner. In Charleston, Margaret Reed received an invitation to attend the trial as the victim's family representative. She handwrote a letter to Ava, "I'll be there, not to see her punished, but so Thomas can rest in peace." On September 28, the final witness list was finalized. DNA technician Dr. Leah Watson, mechanic Raymond Cole, the bank employee confirming the forged checks, and Ava Colson herself as lead investigator. The evening before filing with the court, Ava stood on the hotel porch, watching the lights reflect on the river's surface. The croaking frogs and muddy scent evoked the image of the first night she had set foot in Beaufort years ago. She wondered if justice had come too late. 44 years was nearly half a lifetime. But then she recalled Mixon's words, "The marsh can't keep secrets forever." Justice, though slow, was still justice. Ava extinguished the unlit cigarette, turned back to her room, closed a case file, and placed it on the desk, where bold print on the red cover blazed. State of South Carolina versus Elaine Reed. On October 10, 2024, Elaine Reed's trial officially opened at the Beaufort County Courthouse. From early morning, dozens of reporters and residents crowded the gates, TV cameras sweeping toward the steps where Elaine descended from the police car, her face serene, eyes hidden behind silver-rimmed glasses. Inside the courtroom, the dark woodroom smelled of old varnish and hummed with the creak of ceiling fans. Judge Raymond Harlan sat on the high bench, looking down at the jury box of 8 women and 4 men, all Lowcountry residents, who had once revered Elaine as a moral icon. In the front row, Margaret Reed, Thomas's sister, sat quietly, clutching a white handkerchief, next to Ava Colson, the lead investigator, with her steely and composed gaze. At the prosecution table, Jack Hendricks adjusted his tie, opening the trial with a resonant baritone. "Your Honor, we will prove that Elaine Reed deliberately murdered her husband on the night of July 18, 1980, and for over 40 years, she has lived off that death." In the opening statements, Hendricks projected crime scene excavation images on the screen: the skeleton found in the St. Helena Marsh, the silver ring engraved, TR 1977, the bullet wound through the rib bone. He stated firmly, "No one shoots themselves, wraps themselves in tarpaulin, drags themselves into the mud, and disappears for 40 years. The courtroom fell deathly silent. For the defense, Douglas Payne rose, beginning in a calm tone, "Ladies and gentlemen, Elaine Reed has lived with an irreplaceable loss. She is not a murderer, but a victim of circumstance and mistaken judgment. If the shooting happened, it was an accident, an act of self-defense, when her husband, a hot-tempered man under financial pressure, threatened her life." He turned his gaze to Elaine. "She didn't run from sin, she just kept living to survive." Witnesses were called one by one. Dr. Leah Watson, head of forensics, confirmed the cause of death as a close-range chest gunshot, and the DNA from the woman's hair, on the victim's shirt, matched Elaine Reed. Raymond Cole, the mechanic from Walterboro, recounted how a woman brought in a green Chevy to reupholster the seats in early 1981, describing a familiar perfume scent. The bank employee presented photocopies of checks with Thomas Reed's forged signature, and the DNA technician from Colombia explained in detail how the felt fibers on the tarpaulin matched the type of seats in Elaine's former car. Each time evidence emerged, Margaret Reed's gaze dropped lower, her hand gripping the handkerchief tighter. When it was Ava Coulson's turn to testify, Hendricks asked her to recount the investigation's journey. She spoke slowly and clearly, from Harold Nixon's letter to the 2024 bone discovery. "Technology may change, but human nature doesn't," she said. "Those small pieces of evidence, fabric fibers, cigarette butts, forged checks when put together, spoke for the dead. Thomas Reed didn't leave. He was killed, and the perpetrator was the last person to see him." The jury sat in silence, only the hum of the air conditioner in the thick air. In the afternoon, Attorney Payne called Elaine Reed to the stand. She walked slowly, hands trembling, voice hoarse. "I never intended to kill Thomas. That night, he got angry, grabbed my wrist. I was scared. The gun went off. I don't remember how. I panicked. I just wanted it all to disappear." Hendricks rose for cross-examination. "So why didn't you call the police, give him a proper burial, instead of wrapping his body in tarpaulin, dumping it in the marsh, then forging signatures and collecting insurance money?" Elaine didn't answer. Tears flowed, but her face retained that strangely serene composure, as if she were crying not for guilt, but because it was finally time to stop. The trial stretched into the evening, as the last sunlight poured through the windows, casting a honey-colored glow on everyone's faces. The judge declared a recess, with the jury to deliberate all the evidence the next morning. As police led Elaine from the room, reporters' flashes popped again, the lights reflecting off the tears on Margaret's face. She stood, saying softly to Ava, "40 years, and finally my brother gets to speak." Outside, wind from the marsh blew in, carrying humidity and the chirping of insects, like whispers from secrets, long waiting to be revealed under the light of justice. On the morning of October 11, 2024, the Beaufort courtroom was packed tight with people. Outside, hundreds of townsfolk still stood along the courthouse steps, silent, in the humid breeze from the Combahee River. The air hung thick, like it was waiting for a storm. Elaine Reed stepped inside in a light gray blazer, her face pale but her eyes strangely bright. Up front, the jury sat in a row, each holding a thick stack of files, their faces tense. Judge Raymond Harlan rapped the wooden gavel lightly, his voice booming low and gravelly. "Beaufort County Court, State of South Carolina, versus the defendant Elaine Marie Reed, now proceeds to the verdict." Every sound fell silent. Ava Coulson stood in the investigators' row, next to Margaret Reed, whose hands clutched an old handkerchief crumpled to shreds. The court clerk handed the sealed envelope to the judge, who opened it slowly, morning light falling on the yellowed paper. "We, the jury, having considered all the evidence, testimony, and arguments from both sides," he read, his voice steady but heavy as stone, "find the defendant Elaine Marie Reed guilty of second-degree murder and concealment of a body." The words had barely landed when a collective sigh rippled through the room. Margaret raised a hand to her mouth, tears spilling unchecked. In the back rows, a few women from the church group bowed their heads, some murmuring prayers. Elaine sat still, eyes fixed straight ahead, no reaction, not a single tear. She just nodded faintly, as if finally hearing what she'd been waiting for, not the sentence, but the end. The judge continued with the sentencing: 15 years imprisonment for second-degree murder, and 5 years for concealment of a body, to be served consecutively for a total of 20 years. The defendant may be eligible for parole after 10 years, based on age and health. He looked straight at Elaine. "Mrs. Reed, justice comes slow but never fails. Today, we don't just close a case, we close 44 years of lies." The gavel struck, 3 echoes bouncing off the wooden walls, ending the town's longest days. Reporters rushed outside to call in, broadcasting live. A news bulletin that afternoon read, 20-year sentence for widow Elaine Reed, South's most famous cold case closes. At the Bay Street coffee shop, folks sat watching TV, no one voicing triumph. "She was wrong, but I still feel sorry for her," a man said softly. The woman beside him nodded. "A lifetime living in lies. What's that but a prison anyway?" In the Baptist church, Pastor Horton offered prayers for Thomas Reed's soul and for the one who caused his death. "Justice isn't for punishment," he said, "but for illumination." After the trial, Ava and Margaret left the courthouse in silence. Reporters swarmed, questions flying. "What does Mrs. Reed think of the verdict?" Margaret paused, eyes to the sky. "I'm not happy, but I feel peace." Ava, asked about her emotions, just replied, "The truth has spoken, the rest is up to time." She watched the prisoner transport roll over the Combahee Bridge, where wind whipped the swaying reeds. Elaine sat behind the iron grate, head slightly bowed, hands clutching a rosary. Maybe in that moment, she recalled the night in 1980, the gunshot cracking through the river's damp air, and black mud swallowing every sound. As the van vanished behind the tree line, Ava stood alone on the courthouse steps, feeling an odd emptiness. She thought of Harold Mixon, the man who'd sent the old files, and told herself that if he were alive, he'd be smiling. The St. Helena swamp had finally answered. It didn't speak in words, but in bones, in fabric threads, in a community's memories. And as the river wind blew through, carrying scents of water and jasmine, Ava closed her eyes softly. In the rustling wind, she thought she heard Mixon's voice echoing, "Justice only sleeps, it never dies." After the trial, Beaufort eased back into its familiar slow rhythm, but it was no longer the same town. The story of Elaine Reed still splashed across front pages, then faded quietly, leaving echoes in coffee shop chats, amid the cicadas' hum and the river's musty smell. The wooden house by the Combahee, once a symbol of resilience, now stood sealed, windows shuttered tight, eaves peeling paint, the Reed residence, sign tilting amid the vines. No one wanted to buy it, and no one dared tear it down. Folks said on still nights, you could see a faint light in the old kitchen, or the shadow of a woman on the porch, gazing at the river, but then they'd shake their heads, calling it swamp fever fancy, the kind where memories linger like mist, dissolving but never gone. Margaret Reed returned to Charleston, after attending her brother's final funeral. Thomas's remains were laid to rest in St. Helena Cemetery, on a quiet afternoon, under amber skies. She placed the TR 1977 ring on the coffin lid, whispering, "You're home now, Thomas." No one wept loudly, just the wind brushing the eucalyptus trees, carrying salt and pine resin. After 44 years, the Reeds finally had a real grave, a place for candles instead of prayers to the void. Margaret wrote a thank you letter to Ava Colson, the last line in a trembling hand. "You've done what we thought impossible. My brother can rest, and so can I." Ava read the letter in silence, folded it, and tucked it in her desk drawer, beside an old photo of Sheriff Harold Mixon, a man she'd never met, but felt like an invisible mentor. In the Baptist church, the first Sunday service after the trial unfolded in hushed tones. Pastor Horton spoke briefly, "Justice may come late, but grace is never tardy." The congregation bowed heads in prayer for Thomas's soul, and for Elaine, the woman they both resented and pitied. The charity fund in her name was dissolved, remaining funds used to erect a memorial for missing victims along the Combahee riverbank. On the black steel plaque, simple words were etched, "For those once forgotten, the truth always finds its way home." When it was unveiled, Ava stood amid the crowd, gazing at the water reflecting the late sun, feeling small in time's vast flow. Elaine Reed was incarcerated at the Women's Correctional Facility in Columbia. Word from her lawyer said she rarely spoke to anyone, just read the Bible, and worked in the vegetable garden. Some said she spent hours writing letters, but never mailed them. Those letters perhaps to the dead, or to her past self, the woman who'd believed silence could replace truth. Asked about the case, the warden just said, "She's calm to the point of eerie, like the punishment started 40 years ago. Months later, Ava returned to Beaufort one last time to close the files. She parked by the Combahee Bridge, where salty sea wind swept through the marsh. Below, the river flowed silently, as if nothing had happened. She opened her notebook, writing the final line in the case report. The truth doesn't sleep in the mud, it just waits for someone to find it. Then she closed it, set white flowers on the bridge rail, and stood quiet for a long time. In the distance, the church tolled 3 afternoon bells. In Beaufort life went on, but in those chimes, everyone heard the faint echo of a soul set free, and a reminder that sometimes, justice isn't just a sentence, its memories return to the forgotten. When fall arrived, Beaufort draped in pale gold, and the scent of sea salt, mingling with marsh wind. Wet roads, ancient oaks stretching branches woven overhead, and the Combahee still flowing quietly, like the town's own timeline. Thomas and Elaine Reed's wooden house, now choked with vines, eaves rotting, but at dusk, light from the opposite house, still glanced across the water, as if to illuminate the past. Folks said on moonless evenings, if you stood on the bridge, you could hear footsteps along the old dock, slow and steady, like the marsh's breath. In Beaufort, no one dared claim what was real. They just knew this place held every person's memory, every sin, every lie. The swamp didn't forget, it only waited to speak. A year after the trial, Ava Colson returned to Beaufort, this time, not as an investigator, but just a passerby. She came to the bridge, where she'd stood that late night before, placing a bunch of white flowers on the rail. River wind, briny and sharp, tousled her hair, carrying wet grass and mud scents. She thought of Harold Mixon, of Margaret Reed, of Elaine's serene eyes on sentencing day. It all seemed still here somewhere, hidden under the South's thick fog, in the melancholy light of lazy afternoons. Ava looked down at the water, reflecting a speckled golden sky, and whispered, "You were right. The swamp never stays quiet. It just speaks its own way." She tossed the flowers gently into the river, petals floating, swirling like 1,000 memory fragments drifting to rest. In the Baptist church, Pastor Horton still led prayers every Sunday, and after each sermon, he referenced the Reed case as a cautionary tale. "Justice doesn't always wear a kind face," he said, "but it comes so we learn to see each other in truth." The riverbank memorial, now mossed green, its etched words still legible. For those once forgotten, the truth always finds its way home. Whenever the wind blew, the small flag beside it fluttered faintly, making a sound like the past shallow breath. At the Columbia Correctional Facility, Elaine Reed lived quietly. A guard said she spent most of her time in the prison library, reading books, and keeping a journal. Some days she'd sit for hours by the window, overlooking the vegetable garden, sunlight slanting through the bars, her face so blank you couldn't tell what she was thinking. One morning, the warden found a scrap of paper on her table, handwriting shaky. "I once believed silence was salvation, but silence only sinks you deeper into sin." No one knew who it was for, and no one asked. The scrap was tucked in her Bible, then lost to time. The town of Beaufort endured as before, serene, scented with sea and pine, but now scarred within. Tourists paused at the Combahee Bridge, read the memorial, snapped photos, then moved on, unaware that beneath their feet, the river cradled secrets of centuries of human lives. At sunset, light on the water formed a golden-orange streak, like an eternal scar. And if you listened close, amid the wind and late-season cicadas, you might hear an indistinct whisper from somewhere. The swamp keeps everything, sins, truths, and souls unrested. The story of Thomas and Elaine Reed is not only a cold case solved after more than 4 decades, but also deeply reflects the dark corners of modern American society, where faith, reputation, and moral image sometimes obscure the truth. For 40 years, a small community in Beaufort believed in the perfect facade of the resilient wife, with no one daring to question it. Only when DNA technology and the determination of people like Ava Colson brought the truth to light did people realize that what seemed most serene could hide the deepest sin within it. This story reminds us of the value of truth and transparency, issues that America today still faces, from political ethics controversies, wrongful convictions, to family problems hidden behind an outward shell of stability. Elaine's choice to remain silent throughout her life not only destroyed herself, but also kept the entire town living in illusion, like how society sometimes stays silent in the face of wrong, because it fears losing the false stability. Technology, like DNA in the story, has proven the power of justice and science in restoring the truth, but more importantly, it is human courage to look straight at what has been buried. In a country that values freedom and individuality like the United States, the lesson from the Reed case reminds us that freedom cannot be separated from the responsibility of honesty, with oneself, with the community, and with the past. Because only when we dare to confront the truth, even if late, can we truly be liberated. If you believe that the truth always finds a way to rise from the darkness like the Combahee River has done, please hit subscribe to join us in continuing the journey to uncover cold cases buried by time. Thank you for following along to the end of the story. See you in the next video where justice is called upon once again.